for inviting me here again. And first of all, I must apologise that this is completely on Zoom this time rather than a hybrid meeting, because I was fully intended to be at the Francis Peak Centre today, but unfortunately I tested positive for COVID early last week, and so quite rightly the committee decided we needed to move this meeting fully to Zoom. I'm completely negative now. I wish I could be completely positive. I'm completely negative. And I didn't have many symptoms at all. In fact, I thought I just had a heavy cold. But this meeting is not to discuss our experiences with COVID. I know some of you have tested positive very recently and are going through that. I'm sure some have tested positive before. But it's a pity I can't be with you all face to face, but hopefully we can have a good conversation and a good talk this afternoon. And on that point, I just wanted to say, I'm very happy to answer any questions people would like to save till the end of the talk, either in the chat, which I know Neil is certainly going to monitor in case I miss it, or I think verbally, but Neil will take you through how to answer any questions when we come to that point. And as Angela said, my in to giving this talk is that I did actually work at Lambeth Palace for about 7 years at the beginning of my career in the library. And so that will be part of what I'm going to talk about today. But I'm also going to talk about the history of the palace, the gardens, a little bit about the Garden Museum, about the park next door. And so to give you a rounded picture of what the palace is like, where it's been, and what you might be able to see there when you visit. So I'm now going to share my screen, and I'm going to be doing a PowerPoint. So there'll be images to look at while I'm talking through those pictures. And I will now share my screen, hopefully. And you should all have a lovely photograph of Lambeth Palace from the air as it is today. And I can see Neil, so I can see him nodding his head. So hopefully you can all see that. And I think probably most of you know where Lambeth Palace is. It's just on the south side of the Thames by Lambeth Bridge, just along the road from St Thomas's Hospital, which in this image you can see just to the left-hand corner by the river. And you can see some of the main buildings of the palace, which I'll be talking about this afternoon. Some of you may have been to the palace already. Some of you may have used the library or visited the garden. But if you haven't, there are opportunities to visit the library, to visit the gardens, which I'll let you know about nearer the end of the talk. And obviously, as this is being recorded, you'll be able to see them on the screen afterwards, but also check on the Lambeth Palace website to see when their open days are, when you can visit the library and so on. So that's the building I'm going to be talking about today. There are a number of places I've used for my research from my own background. I very much appreciated the assistance from Lambeth Palace Library's own website. It's Lambeth Palace's own website, and some of those histories of the palace, which I've used in my career, one by previous librarian Dodwell, and so on. But this is the flavour of what you'll see if you go there, a flavour of some of the kind of things that you might not think might be in Lambeth Palace. So, just to kick off, I'm going to do a little bit of a history of the palace, but just in case, I'm just going to move on if I can. Let me see if I can move on. There we are. Many of you may be familiar with the Church of England and its institutions, but some of you may not be. And just to give you a flavour of what the Archbishop of Canterbury is in a couple of sentences, the Archbishop of Canterbury is bishop of his own diocese, the Diocese of Canterbury, based around Canterbury Cathedral, and that's where he has his other main residence and his other, if you like, place of work. And that's been the case ever since Augustine was made the first Archbishop of Canterbury, Bishop of Canterbury, in the late 6th century, 598. But as well as being the Bishop of Canterbury and responsible for what goes on in the church in that area, the Archbishop is also the head of what is called the Province of Canterbury, and that's the groupings of dioceses, which is broadly the south of England, or the Midlands and the south of England. The Archbishop of York is responsible for the province of York, which is basically from Cheshire across to Sheffield northwards. The Archbishop of Canterbury has wider responsibility south of that line. But also the Archbishop of Canterbury is de facto the head of the Church of England within England, not within Northern Ireland, Wales or Scotland, although he was responsible for Wales up until 1920, when the Welsh Anglican Church went independent. So he has this position as the head of the Church of England in the whole of England, but he only has certain responsibilities within the north of the country. And as well as that, the role that you're probably almost familiar with, he's also head of what's known as the Anglican Communion, which is the grouping of Church of England based churches across the world, which covers most countries in the world. And he leads that in a similar, though not an exact way, to the way the Queen leads the Commonwealth. The two are not synonymous in terms of areas. The Anglican Communion covers the whole of the world, as I've said, but that affects what goes on at the palace, but what the Archbishop does now and what the Archbishop's done in the past, and why Lambeth Palace is not just the London seat of somebody whose main responsibility is in Canterbury, but the Archbishop of Canterbury has always had a national role and an international role, and that's affected both the archives that you see in the library, but also how the palace has been used in the past. Just to give you a flavour of what the Archbishop did and still does in many ways. So, to do a little bit about Lambeth Palace, this is an image of Lambeth Palace from 1647. And you'll see, if you can read the Latin at the top, that actually it was originally called Lambeth House. And it was really only started to be called Lambeth Palace at around the time of this document, in about the 1640s through to 1660s. But Lambeth House gives you a really good idea of what it was. If you think of it as a country house that happened to be in London, it was the Archbishop's country house in London. And so the kind of things you see there, a great hall, fortifications, reception areas, residential suites, are very much the kind of things you might find at Penshurst Place or many of those country houses around London. And it's some of those houses that used to be in London, but are now mostly being destroyed and other buildings taken their place, where members of the nobility, members of other bishops had their London residence. Of course, when Lambeth Palace was first built, and we're talking about around about 1200, 1190, it was still in the country. London was a way away. But if you think of Lambeth as a country house, it gives you a feel for what that building looks like, rather than Hampton Court or another palace, either in London, in England, UK or overseas. It was never built as a palace. And in fact, just like many country houses, it was added to, knocked down, repaired, other bits added on throughout its history, which is why it's not got one single layout. And those are the bits I'll be describing through the next part of my talk. In fact, this image is quite good, because if you know Lambeth Palace today, it looks very, very similar to this image. You'll see on the right behind those trees, the St Mary at Lambeth, which is a parish church, which I'll talk a little bit about, but was never part of the palace. It just happened to be the parish church right next to Lambeth Palace's gates. And the rest of it, I'll go through in a little bit more detail. But the palace itself, the house, the archbishops had a connection with it from the Norman conquest up to the 1190s, but it's only in the 1190s that they acquired land in that area and started to build their London house. Some of the earliest parts of the building date from the early 13th century, the 1220s. Parts of the chapel you can see and parts of the crypt underneath it do date from that 1220s period. This is obviously a much later picture, but also, like many buildings, it's been adapted and destroyed and damaged at various points in its history, and it's been rebuilt and so on. But the earliest parts that survive for Lambeth Palace date from that 1220s period, and parts of them are the chapel, which you can see today. And gradually it evolved as the archbishops had a growing role within London politics, national politics, international politics, which is what they've had for many, many centuries. And it became as important for the Archbishop of Canterbury to be in London as it was in Canterbury. And throughout its history, as traced through the archives, you can see that role that the Archbishop has had within political life, both within the religious aspects of that, but also in what might be called mainstream political life of the country. And the palace evolved as part of that. And one part of its evolution, again on that riverbank frontage, is what's now known as the Lollards Tower. It was probably built in the 14th century, in the 1300s, and it came to be known as the Lollards Tower because it was assumed that Lollards were imprisoned there. The picture on the right is a small prison, which it was said Lollards were imprisoned. Lollards was a name that was specifically used for the followers of John Wycliffe, who was a reforming priest from the 1380s, in some ways seen as a kind of a lead into the Reformation 100 or so years later, although he wasn't particularly connected with that. But Lollards also became a term that was used for many people later on, a general term for people who opposed the church or had problems with the church. So Lollards Tower, again, built in the 1300s, redeveloped a bit, continuing throughout its history. But that's one of those, archetypal features that you can see within the palace today. Lollards, by the way, because I thought someone's going to ask where the word Lollards come from, and it looks as though it comes from a Dutch word meaning to sing, and it was taken as a kind of pejorative word as people who mumbled their prayers and who were seen as not, if you like, fully qualified as priests were or alleged to be to conduct services. And so it was a term of abuse thrown at anybody who didn't like the church at that time or in later years. It's not exactly certain whether any Lollard or Reformation prisoners were actually held there, but it's a very good story, as in most stories. Moving on, the palace has a wonderful building called the Guard Room, and in fact was indeed a place where the palace and the archbishops had their small retainer of, shall we say, a security force. As you might imagine, throughout its lively history and the archbishopric's lively history, he wasn't very popular from time to time. And from time to time, the palace was besieged, notably during the Peasants' Revolt in the 1380s, when the then archbishop fled to the Tower, was then taken from the Tower and murdered as part of the Peasants' Revolt. It was also attacked during the Civil War in William Laud's time and a number of occasions since then and before then. But the Guard Room nowadays is a room you can hire if you go to the Lambeth Palace website, but it's also a room that's used for events within the palace, and was built, well, again, there are medieval connections, but rebuilt in the 17th century. Most notable are the portraits of the archbishops, which you can see on the wall. And for the 18th century, it was always the joke that they seem to have passed the wig round as they became archbishop, because it looks like the same wig was used by archbishop, followed by archbishop, followed by archbishop, until they decided not to wear wigs anymore. But the Guard Room is an interesting place in the palace's history and does feature on tours when they do have tours. More famously, this is probably the part of the palace which is most well known. It's called Mortons Tower, after Archbishop Morton, who had it built in the 1480s. Again, there was a guardhouse there before then. But this is a very impressive early Tudor building. It has personal memories for me because the third window up on the right was where I worked when I was at Lambeth Palace. This tower was used initially as both an archive and a prison. Now, I won't tell you which I felt most at home with when I was working there. But basically, when I was there, this was, apart from the ground floor, which was the caretaker's flat, in two halves either side of the ground floor. The rest of it was archive storage. So basically I worked in a strong room for 7 years, up a spiral staircase, which is probably what most people think archivists do anyway. So I fell into the stereotype very quickly. But it's interesting to see that it was used for both holding prisoners, but actually for holding archives ever since it was built, right up to virtually the present day. And I'll come on to the point that it's no longer part of the library because the library has moved to new premises down the building. If you're lucky, you may have visited already, but it's literally only opened, and it is really worth a visit when you manage to go there, if you can go there. Moving around the palace, you come to a building called the Great Hall, which is the building centre to the right of the screen you see. Now, again, this is why I mentioned this is like a country house. Many country houses that have their origins in the Middle Ages, like Penshurst Place, still retain that medieval Great Hall, and there was a Great Hall there throughout the medieval period. Unfortunately for the hall and for the palace, during the Commonwealth period, when the Archbishop of Canterbury's role was abolished, the Commonwealth took control of the palace and largely took it to pieces. The then Great Hall was taken down, destroyed, the robbery taken away and used for other purposes. It was used as a prison. It was used as a secular administrative building. The library was taken over by Cambridge University, which I'll come to. But on the restoration in the 1660s, the then Archbishop Juxon, had it rebuilt. And basically the building you see now, beyond repairs that were done after the Second World War, when it was very heavily damaged, is the 17th century building that Archbishop Juxon put up. Even when he put it up, he wanted to have it in a medieval style. And so when Pepys visited, he said, a bit like you find some buildings today, he said in that modern historic style. In other words, he wasn't particularly in favour of it, but it's the building you see today, and this is the interior of it. It's a wonderful hammer beam roof, but it's not medieval, it's 17th century. And a wonderful open space, which, as you can see, is often used for talks, presentations, and from the 19th century as part of the library. And when I worked there, that's where many of the books were held, as you can see around the walls. It's had many purposes. I'll come to one or two of them, but particularly as one of the Archbishop's great meeting places to have conferences and events and so on and so forth, and state events as well. And as you can see, a very fine building, very fine room. We then move on, so that the palace, the house evolved. It had medieval buildings, it's got restoration buildings. It was higgledy-piggledy until at the beginning of the Victorian period, or the 1820s, 1830s, the then Archbishop Howley, felt that it needed attention and he wanted something more impressive, and engaged Edward Blore, who was the surveyor at Westminster Abbey, who later went on to finish off John Nash's work at Buckingham Palace, to basically restore Lambeth Palace. And this is the early Victorian part of the palace that is there today. On every photograph you see, this is Blore's restoration. Restoration meant he knocked down all the buildings that were there to start with and put up this Victorian building with reception rooms, state rooms, private residential rooms, administrative offices on that side of the palace. Just on the left-hand side of that photograph, you can actually see the guard room. And if you went just a little bit to the left, off the shot you'd see the Great Hall. So that's round that courtyard that was there. The courtyard was there before Blaw's time, but it's Blaw's restoration that you see today, and you can see those turrets from a long way around London, and it's the other side of that the Archbishop's Garden is, which we'll come to a little bit later. Weird things you can find at Lambeth Palace. I just want to highlight a couple, because one of the things about Lambeth Palace is it's had a great history, church and state, and these are allegedly King Charles I's gloves that he wore to the scaffold before he was beheaded. Now, if you look in the historical sites, historical record, you will find that there are allegedly a number of these pairs of gloves, all claiming to be the gloves that King Charles I wore to the scaffold. Now, it's highly unlikely he wore 20, but these ones have as good a claim as any. In fact, they were acquired by the library after the Second World War, and the then librarian, Geoffrey Bill, who was librarian when I was at the library, did a huge amount of research, and they're as near to being the ones that probably are the gloves that you can get. They're certainly 17th century gloves. If they weren't Charles's, they were Archbishop Juxon's, who built the Great Hall, but they're quite likely to be. But you wouldn't expect to find them in the palace. The other thing you certainly won't expect to find at Lambeth Palace is a tortoise. This tortoise shell resides at Lambeth Palace and is a really interesting story. I hope most of you haven't heard the story already. Archbishop William Laud brought the tortoise to Lambeth Palace in 1633, when he became Archbishop of Canterbury, and he records the fact that he did it. He may have gone on to be executed as part of the Civil War, but he loved his tortoise. And the tortoise allegedly remained at Lambeth Palace alive until 1753. Who knows? It may have done. When very sadly it drowned when the Thames flooded. The then Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, Thomas Herring, decided that he had to bring another tortoise there. So he writes that he brought his own tortoise as a replacement tortoise for Laud's tortoise that had died. Now, whether that tortoise actually survived 150 years, who knows? I know they're long-lived. Some of you may know more about tortoises than I do. The only sad thing is that back in the day, in the 1880s, the tortoise had been stuffed away. And I must read you this quote by the son of the Archbishop, who went rootling around in the cupboards of Lambeth Palace and said, "I was turning over some dusty relics, old parchment deeds, faded stiff church vestments, seals and crosses that repose in an oak press in the meeting room. There I came upon a tortoise shell at the back of the shelf, and on it a stiff piece of paper pasted in antique brown characters describing the history." I have to say I'm most distressed at the fact that the archives seem to be stuffed in with bits of cross, tortoiseshell and vestments. However, I think the archive storage is a bit better now than it was back in the 1880s. But that tortoise, I believe, is still on display, and you can look at it if you do happen to be able to visit Lambeth Palace. I'm now going to move on to the little bit about the palace I know most about, which is the library. Now, the library has been in existence since 1610. It has material that goes back to before the Norman conquest, and it has material about everything you might imagine from somebody, the role that's been involved in church and state politics nationally and internationally for over 1,000 years. Particularly, I want to draw your attention to the National Archives of the Church of England, because not only does it have records about the Archbishop's work and many, many, many church organisations, church individuals, but since the new library was created down the road, it now houses together the records of those other big Church of England institutions that you may have come across, like the General Synod of the Church of England, the Church Commissioners, and so on. So basically, it is the library and archive of the Church of England and the pre-Reformation Church in England as well, going back to the Norman Conquest. It has the most amazing collections of printed material, manuscript material, archives, and I'll give you a flavour of them, although one could go on sort of ad infinitum about it. As I said already, part of the library was housed until very recently in Mortons Tower. In fact, probably the vast majority of the archives were stored there. They're also stored in the Great Hall. This is one of my predecessors having to carry archives around for a member of the public, hopefully in a better way than he's doing it. And as you can see, this is the Great Hall, and as it was when they had even more books in the library than they had on that 21st century photo, which I showed you. The other thing that Blore did in his great restoration was to build a fireproof room for the rarest books, which is actually over one of the gateways once you've gone through Mortons Tower. And that's where, when I was there, that's where the librarian had his office and where he kept all the rarest books and most of the rarest manuscripts. But as you can see, the library used bits of the palace as its storage and research areas, and it's only, you know, in the last year that it's had its own purpose-built premises. So a little bit about the collections that you might find there. And I should say that there are exhibitions of some of the treasures on at the moment, and those will continue through the years. You can also get a reader's ticket to go and research either some aspects of your family history that might be there, or aspects of London history that you might find there, or other history you might like to look at in the library. But I just thought I'd highlight 3 items from the collections, just to give you a flavour of the kind of things that are there. On the left is probably one of the earliest, or the earliest item at Lambeth Palace Library. It's called the Macdurnan Gospels, and they date from the 9th to the 10th, the 9th to the 10th century, originally commissioned in Ireland for the Bishop of Armagh, Dean of Armagh, but eventually given to Athelstan, King of England, and via circuitous route ended up with Matthew Parker, who was Elizabeth I's favourite archbishop, if you like. And he bequeathed it originally to Cambridge, and then it came to the library. As you can see, it's got similarities to the Book of Kells and other manuscripts, illuminating manuscripts of the period. An amazing document, quite small, not the same as the document in the middle, which is the Lambeth Bible, which is from the 12th century and is one of the most well-known and best examples of the illuminated Bible manuscript, certainly in this country, if not internationally. And certainly for that period, one of the finest examples of an illustrated, very, very large Bible. It's been loaned on for many exhibitions. One exhibition was on the South Bank while I was there, and while I probably shouldn't repeat this, I actually brought it back with a senior member of staff from the South Bank to Lambeth Palace in the back of my Morris Marina, which shows how old it was, how long ago it was, back in the day. I think there are some things you do quietly, some things you do with the police behind you, and this is one of those quiet restorations of the Lambeth Bible to its present location. The document on your right is just one example of the amazing collection of printed collection, which is there as well, because as well as manuscripts, it has an enormous number of very early books, incunabula, those books printed before 1500, but also very rare and precious books on many, many different subjects, obviously including theology, religious history, through to the present day. The example you see on the right is of the Gutenberg Bible. This edition from 1455, so one of the earliest printed books in existence, one of those iconic printed books that, as you see, was printed to look like a manuscript. It was a printed version of a handwritten manuscript, but it's just one example of the most amazing printed collection that you might not know about if you didn't visit Lambeth Palace. It has a very good collection of its own printed books, bequeathed by the person who founded Lambeth Palace Library in 1610, Archbishop Sancroft, who bequeathed his own library, many archbishops after that, but also the library of Sion College, which was a college founded for the clergy in London, and had created its own library and archive of its own. When Sion College closed, its library moved to Lambeth Palace. Its archive moved to London Metropolitan Archives, or vast majority did. So another connection with somewhere else I used to work. One of the other archives that it has, and there are many I could have examples, is the commission for building 50 new churches. While I'm talking, you can guess or remember which those two churches are. But the commission for building 50 new churches was launched in the early 18th century, basically to build new churches to cope with the huge explosion of the population of London at that period. They never actually built 50 churches, and some of which they paid for rather than actually had built. But the one on the right, which you've not guessed already, is St. John Smith Square, was wholly built by the commission. And the one on the left, St. George's in Southwark, just down as you can see from the Shard and from Borough Market. Most of them were built by very well-known architects of the day. And what the archive has is the history of those buildings, the building of them, why they were built, the architectural plans, and so on and so forth. And it's just it's an example of the archive doesn't include just written documents. It's got plans, later photographs, and it covers a lot of London as well. Some churches were built, like St. Luke's, West Norwood, if you like, in homage to the 50 New Churches project much later, but as you can see, in a not dissimilar style. Two other examples to give you a flavour of the archives that cover the whole of the country. On the left it's a document, but it's from what's called the Court of Arches. Now, there still are a whole system of ecclesiastical church courts, were dealt with all sorts of matters that the civil courts didn't used to, and some they still don't. Nowadays, the church courts really deal with church matters. Back in the day, they dealt with more general matters like divorce and marriage issues, that kind of thing. And basically, it was one of the few places where, if you had the money, you could actually effect a divorce. It's called the Court of Arches because it first met in the at St Mary Le Bow on Cheapside, and St Mary Le Bow's Latin name is St Mary de Arcubus, of the bows, which alluded to the bow windows in the church that looked like arches. So St Mary of the Arches, St Mary Le Bow, this is the Great Bell of Bow from St Oranges and Lemons, and that's where the Court of Arches met until the Great Fire of London burned the church to the ground. The Court of Arches has the most salacious documents you would ever wish to meet, because in many of those divorce cases, the evidence of who did what where was very, very plainly and graphically described, sometimes in Latin, many times in English. And so it's one of those, again, you may not expect to find it in Lambeth Palace Library, but they're there. But it also traces the history of divorce, but also other weighty church matters that came before the Court of Arches in its time. The other document I've got is a photograph of the Lambeth Conference. Lambeth Conference was started in 1867 as a way of bringing every single bishop from the Church of England around the world together in one place. Now, this is from not 1867, slightly later, turn of the century. And at that point, every single bishop could fit in the Great Hall. And as you can see, this is the Great Hall you've seen some images of before. The Lambeth Conference still meets about roughly every 10 years, but now it's had to move to Christ Church in Canterbury to the university because there are too many bishops. But this gives you a flavour of the role of the Archbishop of Canterbury then and today, because the Archbishop of Canterbury was vitally involved with the creation of churches and bishoprics throughout what was typically the British Empire, but also in other parts that both declared their independence, like America, or other parts of the world that were never part of the British Empire. It's the Archbishop and the Bishop of London who had very direct responsibility. So within the archives, you can find material on virtually any part of the world you could name. Again, it's one of those facts about the Archbishop's role that affects what you find in the archives. And the great debates that went on there. And of course, nowadays it's very much about, you know, the Church of England in different parts of the world, the Anglican Communion, going in different directions, and how that can be brought together. But just a flavour of the international role of the archbishops. And then to get slightly more personal, what I've described as my archbishops. They're not mine, but when I went to Lambeth Palace Library, my job was to catalogue the papers of these 4 archbishops, all 20th century archbishops of Canterbury, in clockwise order: Randall Davidson on the left, Cosmo Gordon Lang on the top right, William Temple bottom left, and Geoffrey Fisher on bottom right. And I'm not doing a talk on just on them, and the time is moving on. But just to say, their papers again show all the kind of subjects I've been talking about. Randall Davidson, probably one of the most now underrated Archbishop of Canterbury, in my view, had been Dean of Windsor, so he knew the royal family. He was a great friend of Queen Victoria. His correspondence has a lot of correspondence with Queen Victoria. He knew the establishment inside out. He knew his church across the world inside out. And in terms of the archives, many's the time he went to lunch at the Athenaeum with the Foreign Secretary or the Prime Minister. He'd come back, he'd write a memo, and there it will be in the archives. And very often he was bringing information to the government's attention they knew nothing about, because he had, for instance, he had a chaplain in Van in Armenia in the early 19-teens who was a witness to the genocide of the Armenians in that period. And he was giving, basically monthly regular reports of his eyewitness accounts of what was happening, which the Archbishop was able to use and talk to the government about, which the government didn't have. So it was a very interesting relationship that Randall Davidson particularly had with the government in terms of the information he could bring, and one used that in all sorts of conversations that were not just about church and state or church matters, but about all sorts of other things. Cosmo Gordon Lang, most famously or infamously known as the Archbishop known for getting rid of Edward VIII, and for the rather unfortunate radio broadcast he made shortly after Edward VIII's abdication. He was important for many other reasons apart from that, but that's his claim to fame within many people's memory, if you like. William Temple was more an archbishop, probably like a Michael Ramsey or a Rowan Williams. He was a philosopher, thinker, not the greatest administrator in the world. I'm not saying any of the other people I mentioned weren't, but very sadly died in office during the Second World War. Geoffrey Fisher was the archbishop who crowned President Queen Elizabeth, gave her great instructions as to what the coronation was going to be like. Those notes remain in the archive. Had formerly been a headmaster at Repton School, and was known for treating his bishops as, if not the prefects, then junior teachers, who he rather administered in that way. And his great fun was rewriting the constitutions of churches overseas on his way over there. He had many other traits, some of which people liked, some which didn't, particularly his successor, Michael Ramsey, as Archbishop, because Geoffrey Fisher went to the House of Lords and instead of being rather quiet, was forever writing to the Times and writing to his successor saying, I don't think you quite got it right there. So you pay your money, you take your pick. But actually, the papers are fantastic papers. Moving on, that's where the library is today, just down the road. Its entrance is opposite St Thomas's. It has open days, but it also has an exhibition of its treasures, which you can visit. All this information is on the Lambeth Palace website, so you can go back to it. But if you've got a chance before the 8th of April, do have a look. And there's a really, really good Friends of Lambeth Palace Library. If you're not involved already and you're interested in church history, any aspect of that kind, state history, there are great friends to join, have fantastic range of events, lectures, visits. So once you've paid your sub to Dulwich District u3a, you can think about Friends of the Lambeth Palace Library. Moving on to the park and the gardens, and if Angela or Neil shouts at me or does the guillotine, then I'll stop. But I've probably got about 5 minutes left, probably. Now, there are the gardens at Lambeth Palace, which you can go into occasionally, and there's the park behind the palace, which some of you may know, which was part of the Archbishop's estate. But when one of the 19th century archbishops, Archbishop Tate, became Archbishop, he just felt there was too much land and felt that that it could be given over for public use. So this is very much what the park looked like. This is from the Illustrated London News. And he gave over about 9 acres for people just to come and just walk in, not part of his private gardens, but basically became almost a private park, a public park. That was in the early 1870s. And then two things. Basically, there was a movement to get more public parks in London, and the London County Council came into existence that could manage these parks. And in the early 1900s, the Archbishop of Canterbury leased the space, which is Archbishop's Park, which, as far as I understand it, is still owned by the Archbishop of Canterbury, to what is now Lambeth Council, as a public park, and it still functions as a public park, but was originally part of the gardens. The gardens, though, which never used to be open to the public, but were the Archbishop's private gardens, probably laid claim to be one of the oldest sort of public style gardens still in existence in London. There is a quote from the Lambeth Palace Library blog, which I'm very grateful for, from 1236, so almost 800 years ago, from one of their documents talking about the garden, a garden and orchards with pears, other fruits sold at the garden gate, a new herbarium with turfs coming from Archbishop lands at Norwood, which is probably Croydon, as the Archbishop had a palace at Croydon as well, flax and hemp sown in gardens, and a great ditch surrounding the whole site. And then later on, under Archbishop Matthew Parker, in Elizabeth I's reign, there is a detailed description of the gardener's duties, which includes keeping the grass cut low with the scythe, and that the gardener delve and manure the grounds to the best commodity of the owner. So clearly Matthew Parker wasn't just a kind of, absentee gardener. He took a keen interest in what was in the garden. Nowadays, it's maintained by a number of gardeners and it's open to the public. And I can show you that it's open to the public on these days during this year. Now, again, this information is on the website, so you can go there. As far as I know, you can just turn up, which might mean you want to get there early. But if you want to know exact details, go there and you'll find there. This was on the website yesterday, so I know it's up to date. So have a chance. And obviously you can see parts of the palace from the outside as well to get another idea. So absolutely, definitely worth a visit. Finally, that little church I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, St Mary at Lambeth, was the parish church for that area, was a church used by the archbishops, and indeed a number are buried there, including Bishop Sancroft, who gave the library, started the library, and indeed Matthew Parker himself. As you can see, images of what the church used to look like, what it looks like today. It was decommissioned as a Church of England church back in the 1970s, but was rescued from demolition as a garden museum, and is now the Garden Museum, which is again open to the public. The reason it was started as a garden is that two very well-known gardeners from the 17th century, John Tredescant the Elder and John Tredescant the Younger, who gave their name to the plants, the Tredescantiers, were gardeners to the king, certainly the elder, what the younger was. They are buried there. And it was on that connection that the founders of the Garden Museum decided they'd like to found a garden museum, and it's been built on and developed. And if you haven't visited it, you can do it the same day as a visit to the garden. That's a good idea as well. It's got a very nice cafe. So you might want to treat yourself. You may want to walk around the churchyard, because apart from about half a dozen archbishops, you can also find the graves of Elias Ashmole, who founded the Ashmolean Museum, the mother of Anne Boleyn, and finally, but not least, Captain Bligh. So if you ever want to know where Captain Bligh was buried, it's in Lambeth Cemetery, just by Lambeth Bridge. So a lot of things about the palace and the grounds. Hopefully that might have spurred an interest in going there, a bit of interest in the history. Happy to answer any questions you've got. And I'll leave you with a complete misstatement by Ambrose Bierce. I do love Ambrose Bierce, but he obviously didn't check his history, because there's only one archbishop buried in Westminster Abbey. And if you wanted to go on a tour, the rest of them are buried across the UK and Europe, but that's not for me. If you want to do another hike, do that. But hopefully a bit of interest, a bit of an introduction to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Lambeth Palace, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.